On a Tuesday morning in March of 1985, Elara Vance stood in the gravel lot behind Briggs Farm Supply in Beeman, Iowa. Harlan Briggs wiped his hands on his coveralls and called out, "Elara, those Acme augers are junk since the couplings went obsolete, nobody'll pay a dime for 'em." But the surface rust hadn't touched the hardened cutting edges. She just needed to prove it. On the cracked asphalt behind Briggs Farm Supply, the truck tires spat gravel as Elara Vance pulled away, the bed shuddering under the weight of 15 rusted Acme Hand Auger Series 7 units. Her brass pocket watch swung free from its chain against the faded red flannel shirt, the only steady rhythm in the chaos of metal clattering against metal. She shifted gears with a gloved hand, the crescent moon birthmark stark against her right wrist, and pointed the battered pickup north toward Beeman. The augers were junk to Harlan Briggs, scrap iron clogging his lot, but Elara felt the truth in her bones the moment she'd hefted that first one. The couplings might be obsolete for modern rigs, but the hardened cutting edges, still sharp as a razor beneath the surface rust. She dehauled them away for $200, cash paid up front, and now they rode home with her, a gamble rattling in the bed. Let me tell you about corn margins at 12 cents a bushel, because you need to understand why $200 felt like a fortune on a Tuesday morning in March of 1985. It wasn't just thin, it was bloodless. Every kernel she'd planted across her 80 acres was already mortgaged twice over, the bank note due in 6 months with interest climbing like kudzu. Most people see a farmer checking soil and they see worry. Margaret Vance saw patience. Her mother had taught Elara that dirt wasn't just dirt, it was a ledger written in clay and silt, and you balanced it with your hands, not a calculator. Elara pulled into the first field lane, gravel crunching under tires, and killed the engine. She didn't reach for the door handle right away. Instead, she watched the horizon where the sky met the dormant earth, the pale blue of her eyes narrowed against the low sun. This wasn't the time for coffee or oatmeal. This was the time for truth. She swung out of the cab, boots hitting packed earth, and knelt, no gloves. She plunged both hands deep into the soil, right up to her knuckles, feeling for the cold, the damp, the give. Her fingers traced the layers, topsoil dry as bone, but an inch down, a whisper of moisture clinging to the roots of last year's stubble. She brought a clod to her nose, sniffed the faint tang of loam and decay. Not enough. Not nearly enough. The drought of 1983 had cracked the ground like old pottery, and the county extension office had declared half the wells in Hardin County dry by August. Elara's own pump had sputtered its last in July, forcing her to haul water from the town reservoir for her livestock. She'd patched the well, casing herself with salvaged pipe, but it was a stopgap, a bandage on a wound that needed surgery. Now, 2 years later, the memory of that dry well haunted her like a creditor. Let me tell you about a farm loan coming due, because you need to understand why abandoned fields aren't just sad, they're a warning shot across your bow. Elara stood, brushing soil from her palms onto her worn jeans, and scanned the land stretching left and right. To the east, the Miller place. Fenced off, the mailbox bent and rusted, the house shuttered tight with plywood over the windows. Weeds choked the driveway. To the west, the Henderson acres, same story, same silence, same slow surrender to the bank. She knew the numbers. Henderson had taken out a line of credit to buy new irrigation in '82, betting on rain that never came. The interest payments alone had eaten him alive by '84. Now his land sat fallow, waiting for the auction. Elara's throat tightened. Her own 80 acres weren't Henderson's 200, but the math was the same. One dry summer, one missed payment, one foreclosure notice taped to the door. That's all it took. The augers in her truck bed weren't just scrap metal. They were a lifeline, or maybe just another rope to hang herself with. She didn't know yet, but she knew this. Waiting for rain wasn't a strategy. It was a death sentence. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you held something broken in your hands and saw not the flaw, but the shape of what it could become? Answer it for yourself, then remember this moment. Because Elara Vance stood in that field lane and saw something else in those rusted augers, something Harlan Briggs hadn't, something the bank manager wouldn't, something even Margaret might not see yet. She saw a way to drill deeper than her neighbors, cheaper than the co-op, without begging for a loan that would bury her. She climbed back into the truck, the cab smelling of dust and old leather, and cranked the engine. The augers clanged a hollow chorus as she drove on. The farm materialized through the windshield like a photograph developing in a tray. Dusty fields, yes, the dirt the color of weak tea under the late morning sun, but not empty fields, not yet. The modest white farmhouse, paint peeling at the eaves but the porch swept clean. The weathered barn, its red paint long faded to the shade of dried blood, standing solid against the wind. And the granary behind it, small but sturdy, its door slightly ajar. This was home. This was hers, and it was hanging by a thread thinner than baling twine. Elara parked near the barn, killed the engine, and sat listening to the ticks of cooling metal. The silence of the place pressed in, not peaceful but watchful, waiting. She reached for the glove compartment and pulled out a cheap spiral notebook, its cover stained with oil and dirt. Flipping past pages dense with sketches and cramped figures, she found the one she wanted. A diagram of the Acme Augers coupling mechanism, cross-hatched with notes in her precise hand. Next to it, soil layer calculations for this very county. Limestone at 200 feet, sandstone at 300, the water table deeper than anyone expected if you knew how to read the strata. She ran a finger down the column of numbers, hauling $200, welding supplies $85, winch and tripod $150. Total, $435. $435 to build a deep well rig that would cost $12,000 new from the dealer. $435 against a foreclosure notice. Most people see a rusted auger and they see junk. Margaret Vance saw potential. Her mother had taught her that lesson not with words but with actions, mending feed sacks until the fabric was more thread than cloth, repurposing broken tractor parts into garden tools, turning tannery offcuts into saddle patches that outlasted the originals. Waste nothing. See what's there. Elara closed the notebook, the brass clasp clicking shut, and tucked it into her shirt pocket. The weight of it against her chest was steadier than the pocket watch. She climbed down from the truck and walked to the edge of the pasture, where the fence line met the Miller property. She knelt again, not for soil this time, but for the view. From here, she could see the abandoned fields stretching toward the county line, dotted with the skeletal remains of pivot irrigation systems, their arms frozen mid-swing like broken bones. The wind carried the dry scent of thistle and despair. Let me tell you about 18% interest rates, because you need to understand why a farmer in 1985 didn't borrow money to fix a well, he prayed for rain instead. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It ate them whole. It turned prosperous family farms into bang-coned acreage. It left men standing in auction yards with their hats in their hands, watching their livelihood sold off for pennies on the dollar. Elara stood, brushing dirt from her knees, and looked back at her own barn. Her rig wouldn't need a loan. It wouldn't need electricity. It wouldn't need anything but muscle and time and the stubborn refusal to quit. The augers in the truck bed weren't scrap. They were salvation, waiting to be proven. She walked back to the truck, opened the tailgate, and gripped the cold metal of the first auger. It was heavy, 40 pounds at least, and the rust flaked under her fingers like dried blood. But the cutting edges, still sharp, still true, she lifted it out, hefting its weight, feeling the balance. One man's trash, another woman's tool. She carried it toward the granary, the metal scraping against her boot leather, the sound echoing in the stillness. The farm stood quiet behind her, dusty fields, modest house, weathered barn. And for the first time in months, Elara Vance didn't feel the weight of the bank note due in 6 months. She felt the weight of the auger in her hands. And it was a weight she could carry. Elara Vance pushed open the screen door, the familiar creak cutting through the morning quiet of the Beeman farmhouse kitchen. Dust clung to her scuffed brown work boots, tracked in from the gravel drive where her pickup sat humming with the residue of rusted augers. The scent of rolled oats and simmering water wrapped around her like a worn quilt, warm and immediate. At the stove, Margaret Vance stood stirring a cast iron pot, her silver-gray hair pulled back in a low bun, the wooden ruler tucked into her apron pocket catching the light as she moved. Her beige cardigan sat neat over the faded floral print of her dress, the black lace-up shoes planted firmly on the linoleum. Elara's own brass pocket watch, the one her grandfather had left, swung gently against her faded red flannel shirt as she crossed the room. She could feel the small freckle below her left eye tighten with unspoken tension, the crescent moon birthmark on her right wrist almost pulsing against the denim of her sleeve. The weight of the auger still lingered in her palms, a counterpoint to the banknote's ghost pressing at her ribs. Margaret didn't turn. Her spoon scraped rhythmically against the pot's curve, a sound as steady as a metronome. On the counter beside her, a small brass scale held a ceramic bowl. She measured flour into it with a tin scoop, tapping the bowl twice to settle the grains before reading the needle. Not a pinch more, not a crumb less. She'd done this every Tuesday for 40 years, ever since Elara could remember. The kitchen itself breathed precision, the spice jars lined up by height, the dish towels folded to identical rectangles, the calendar on the wall marked with pencil notations so fine they looked like spider tracks. This wasn't fussiness. It was the language Margaret spoke, the grammar of survival in Hardin County, where a misplaced decimal in the ledger could mean losing the South 40. Elara watched her mother's hands, those knuckles swollen from decades of work, move with the certainty of someone who knew exactly how much force a hinge could take before it surrendered. Then Margaret set the spoon down. She walked to the pantry door, opened it, and pulled out a hoe handle snapped clean through near the ferrule. The wood was sun-bleached, the break jagged as a lightning strike. Without a word, she laid it on the oilcloth tablecloth, the floral pattern now stained with generations of coffee rings and pencil marks. From the same apron pocket that held her ruler, she produced a small tin of epoxy and a ball of twine. She mixed the resin and hardener on a scrap of newspaper, her deep brown eyes narrowed in concentration, the light freckles across her nose almost vanishing against her light olive skin. She worked the paste into the fracture with a popsicle stick, then wrapped twine tight around the seam, knotting it with a single decisive tug. Her movements were economical, each one a sentence in a manual only she'd written. Elara remembered watching her do this same thing at age 10, kneeling on this very floor as Margaret showed her how the epoxy needed exactly 7 minutes to set before the twine could bite. How the wood grain had to align just so, like matching the edges of a torn map. How the mole above Margaret's upper lip seemed to darken when she focused. Let me tell you about that epoxy, because you need to understand how a woman measures hope before you can understand why Elara Vance would haul rusted augers out of a scrap pile. Most people see a broken hoe handle and they see kindling, something to toss on the burn pile come winter. Margaret saw a fracture that could be bridged with $2.40 worth of materials. She saw the tensile strength sleeping in the wood grain, waiting for someone to wake it up. She saw the handle's history, the sweat it had carried, the rows it had turned, and knew its story wasn't finished. That was the difference, not magic. Not stubbornness, just the quiet arithmetic of what remained usable beneath the surface damage. Margaret tied off the twine and set the handle aside to cure. Only then did she turn to her daughter, her gaze sweeping over Elara's dust-streaked face, the military-straight posture that never bent even when exhaustion pulled at her bones. She didn't ask about the truck. She didn't need to. The look in Elara's pale blue eyes said everything, the same look she'd worn at 16 when she tried to rebuild the old tractor transmission in the granary. Margaret slid a chipped mug of coffee across the table, the steam curling like a question mark in the air. Her voice was low, the rasp of someone who'd spoken little until it mattered. Nothing is truly broken until you stop trying to fix it. She said it like stating the time, no flourish, no plea. It was a fact as settled as the limestone under their fields. Then she went back to the stove, her slightly stooped shoulders moving with the rhythm of the oatmeal. But this story doesn't start with that hoe handle cooling on the tablecloth. It starts with the smell of newsprint and machine oil in a child's hands years before Elara ever touched an auger. It starts with the blue notebook Margaret kept on the top shelf of her bedroom dresser, the one Elara wasn't supposed to touch until she was 12. The one she'd climbed for anyway at 9, her small fingers tracing the diagrams inside, cross-sections of carburetors, wiring schematics for the grain dryer, calculations for soil pH adjustments scribbled in the margins. Margaret had been the county's first female extension agent in 1953, a position she'd held for 11 years before the gossip about her unfeminine ambitions drove her back to the farm. Her notebooks weren't just records, they were maps. Each page showed where the ground gave way and where it held, how a cracked piston could be rebored, why certain clays needed a wider auger bit to prevent collapse. Elara had pored over them by kerosene lamp, the brass key to the dresser drawer heavy in her pocket, memorizing the tolerances for drill couplings, the weight distribution for well casings. She learned that rust wasn't failure, it was just iron meeting oxygen, a reaction that could be reversed with vinegar and elbow grease. She learned that every scrap pile held a secret language if you knew how to read the scars. Margaret returned to the table, placing a bowl of oatmeal before Elara. Elara sorting augers in the granary, dust motes dancing in light. The air smelled of rust and old hay, thick enough to taste on the back of the tongue. She knelt in the straw brass pocket watch swinging free from her flannel shirt as she lifted another Acme Hand Auger Series 7 unit from the pile. Her fingers traced the cracked coupling where the steel had fatigued, that little crescent moon birthmark on her right wrist catching the sunbeam slicing through the granary slats. Most people see rusted scrap and they see worthless metal. Margaret Vance saw rusted scrap, and she saw a problem that cost money to solve. But this story doesn't start with Elara dragging those augers from Harlan Briggs's scrap pile. It starts with the language of failure, the quiet grammar of things thrown away. Let me tell you about couplings, because you need to understand why a machine shop pays to get rid of perfectly good steel. See, Briggs Farm Supply had just installed new computerized lathes in 1984. Those old augers, their couplings were a quarter-inch too wide for the new feed mechanisms. Storing 1,500 units would cost him $300 in warehouse fees. Hauling them to the landfill cost $200. So he paid Elara $20 to take them off his hands and clear the space. The math was simple and brutal. Scrap value per auger, maybe 50 cents melted down. Storage cost per unit, 20 cents. 20 cents times 1,500 meant $300 bleeding from his bottom line every month, so he called them junk. But junk is just material waiting for the right eyes. Elara knew better. She knew steel doesn't lie. It tells you exactly what it can do if you speak its language. And she'd been learning that language since she was knee-high to a grasshopper watching Margaret measure flour with the wooden ruler always tucked in her apron pocket. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you held something everyone else had written off and felt its hidden strength? Go ahead, think about it. I'll wait right here. You felt it, didn't you? That little hum beneath the surface. That's what Elara felt in that granary. She pulled a small magnet from her jeans pocket, the kind mechanics use to find dropped bolts. She pressed it to the auger's shaft. The pull was strong, immediate, good. Magnetic attraction meant the steel still had its crystalline structure intact. Rust on the surface was just a skin, not the bone. She reached for her three-cornered file next, the teeth worn smooth from years of use. She scraped a shallow groove across the rust. Underneath, the metal gleamed silver and hard, no pitting, no soft spots. She ran her thumbnail along the edge, still sharp enough to nick skin. Most people see rust and they see decay. Margaret Vance saw rust and she saw a surface story. The real story was underneath. The auger wasn't dead, it was just sleeping. And Elara knew exactly how to wake it up. She remembered the yellowed pages of that 1958 vocational manual she'd found at the Grinnell Library sale, cost her $0.25. The spine was broken, the cover stained with what looked like motor oil. But inside, a professor named Elias Thorne had written one sentence that changed everything. Hardened edges resist surface corrosion. The steel in these augers was case-hardened. That meant the outer layer was tough as nails, designed to chew through dirt without wearing down. The rust was just a costume. The real strength was locked inside. She could feel it in her hands now. This wasn't scrap. This was salvage, ready-made tools paid for by someone else's mistake. She stacked the good augers to her left, the ones with solid shafts and sharp edges. To her right went the rejects, those with hairline cracks near the coupling or shafts bent from careless stacking. She worked in silence, the only sound the scrape of metal on wood floor and the occasional sigh of the granary settling. Her notebook lay open beside her, pages filled with cramped handwriting and soil diagrams. She flipped to a page marked Hardin County Geological Survey. The county extension office had given her those maps for free, thinking she was just another farmer checking water tables. They didn't know she was hunting layers. Clay at 50 feet, gravel at 120, sandstone bedrock at 300. Each layer demanded a different approach. Clay gummed up standard bits, gravel chewed through cheap steel, sandstone needed precise torque to avoid shattering the drill stem, but these augers, they were built for exactly this. Their helical flights could clear clay without clogging. The hardened edges could slice through gravel like butter. And the modular design meant she could swap sections as she drilled deeper. She ran her finger down the survey notes. 120 feet to hit water in most of Hardin County, but the dealer rigs charged $5,000 a well because they had to amortize that $12,000 machine. Elara's rig would cost $435 to build. The math was so clean it hurt. She pulled the vocational manual from her back pocket now, its pages soft from handling. She found Thorne's diagram of soil resistance coefficients. Clay required a 4-inch auger diameter to maintain torque. Gravel needed 6 inches to prevent binding, too small and the bit would stall, too big and it would tear the whole walls loose. She copied the numbers into her notebook, her pencil moving fast. 4-inch for clay, 6-inch for gravel. The numbers felt alive in her hand. This wasn't guesswork, it was physics, it was metallurgy. It was the quiet music of materials meeting their purpose. She closed the manual, its oil-stained cover warm against her palm. Up to this point, Elara had been working alone in the shadows. That was about to flip, because what she was seeing wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. The augers had been engineered for this work. The soil layers were fixed by geology. The only variable was who had the guts to connect them. She picked up another auger, testing its weight. Solid, reliable, paid for and forgotten. She thought about Harlan Briggs laughing when she'd asked for the scrap pile. The silence had lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing, that big belly laugh that started deep in his chest and shook his whole frame. He'd wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, the freckle cluster on his right temple disappearing into the wrinkles. "Girl," he'd said, "those things haven't drilled a well since Eisenhower. They're museum pieces," but Elara hadn't argued. She just nodded, thanked him for the $20 and loaded the augers into her truck. Argument was for people who needed to be right. She needed results, and results came from understanding what others missed, like the fact that these augers used the same high-carbon steel as modern drill bits. Or that the gravel layer in Hardin County hadn't changed since 1958. Or that a farmer with a dry well didn't care about computerized lathes, he cared about water. She stacked the last good auger onto her growing pile. 412 units, enough for 40 rigs with spares for broken stems. She ran her hand along the shafts, feeling the subtle variations in the steel. Some were smoother, some had a faint vibration when tapped. She sorted them by feel now, her fingers reading the metal like braille. The ones that hummed true went to the front. The ones that felt dead went to the back. It wasn't magic, it was metallurgy. It was knowing that steel has a song and fatigue kills the song first. She checked her notebook again. The calculations had to be perfect. One mistake in the soil layer depth and the auger would bind, snap the stem and collapse the hole. She'd seen it happen to old man Peterson last summer. His rig had cost him $6,000. He'd lost 3 weeks of crops waiting for repairs. Elara wouldn't have that luxury. Her rig had to work the first time. Because when the drought hit, and it would hit, the whole county would be lining up for Wells. And her $435 rig would be the only thing standing between them and ruin. She pulled a calculator from her pocket, the plastic case cracked from years of use. She ran the numbers again. Cost per well, $350 in materials and labor. Dealer price, $5,000. Savings per well, $4,650. Multiply that by the 80 dry wells reported in the county last year alone. The number was staggering, but she didn't smile, not yet. Numbers were just promises until the steel met the dirt. She flipped to a fresh page in her notebook, the paper crisp under her pencil. She drew 2 columns, clay layer, gravel layer. Next to each she wrote the auger specs, 4-inch diameter, 6-inch diameter. She underlined them twice. These weren't suggestions, they were laws written in steel and soil. The vocational manual had taught her that. Professor Thorne had known it 50 years ago, and now Elara knew it too. She closed the notebook, the brass clasp snapping shut with a sound like a lock turning. Her fingers brushed the small freckle below her left eye, a habit when she was thinking hard. Outside, the wind kicked up dust from the field. Inside, the augers waited. They'd been paid for. They'd been engineered. They'd been forgotten. But not by her, never by her. She stood, her knees stiff from kneeling on the hard floor. She walked to the granary door, looking out at the fields, dry and cracking already in May. The drought was coming. It always did. But this time she'd be ready. She turned back to the augers, her shadow stretching long across the pile. One more pass, just to be sure. She picked up an auger near the bottom of the reject pile. Something about the weight felt off. She scraped the rust with her file. Silver gleamed underneath. She tested the magnet, strong pull. She ran her thumbnail along the edge, sharp. She flipped it over. There, near the coupling, a hairline cracked no wider than a spider's thread. Most people wouldn't have seen it, but Elara saw it. She set it aside. One bad auger could kill the whole rig. She couldn't afford that, not now, not ever. She went back to the good pile, counting them again, 411, close enough. She'd weld spares from the rejects. She opened her notebook to the diagram page. Her pencil hovered over the lines. Clay layer requires 4-inch auger. Gravel needs 6-inch. She wrote it clearly, the letters firm and steady. The words felt like a key turning in a lock. This was it, the foundation, the beginning. The moment when scrap became material, when paid-for steel became a promise kept. She closed the notebook. Her brass pocket watch ticked against her chest, steady as a heartbeat. Outside, a pickup truck kicked up dust on the county road. Probably Harlan Briggs heading home for dinner, still laughing at the girl who took his scrap. Let him laugh. Laughter was cheap. Water wasn't. And come June, when the first well flowed at 300 feet, the laughter would dry up faster than a creek in August. She tucked the notebook into her shirt pocket, the pages warm from her body heat. She ran her hand over the stacked augers one last time, solid, ready, waiting. The granary smelled of rust and possibility. She smiled then, just a little, not because it would be easy, but because it would be hers. Her notebook opened to a diagram. Clay layer requires 4-inch auger, gravel needs 6-inch, not because it would be easy, but because it would be hers. Her notebook opened to a diagram. Clay layer requires 4-inch auger, gravel needs 6-inch. Elara Vance pushed back from the kitchen table, the worn oak creaking under her palms. She laid her ledger down exactly where the morning light from the east window caught the inked columns. The scent of oatmeal still clung to the air, steam long gone cold in the pot on the stove. Her mother Margaret sat across from her, silver hair pulled back in that low bun, the wooden ruler sticking out of her apron pocket like a silent judge. Elara's faded red flannel shirt felt stiff against her neck, the brass pocket watch cold against her chest where it hung on its chain. She didn't speak. Just tapped the ledger's open page with one finger, the crescent moon birthmark on her wrist stark against the paper. Let me tell you about a ledger, because you need to understand what silence costs before you can understand why a number on a page can feel like shouting. Most people see a list of expenses and they see reckless gambling. Margaret Vance saw arithmetic. Her deep brown eyes, framed by those heavy brows, moved down the page with the steady rhythm of a metronome. Elara watched her mother's gaze land on the first line, welding rod $3.40, then coal for the forge $14, the vise $8, winch and tripod $150. Hauling the augers from Briggs Farm Supply $200. Each figure stood naked, no excuses, no rounding up to sound impressive. Just the raw, unvarnished truth of $435 total. Margaret's finger, knotted from decades of farm work and light freckles scattered across the knuckles, traced each entry. Not to erase it, not to scoff, but to feel its weight the same way she'd test the heft of a seed bag before planting. The kitchen held its breath. Elara's pale blue eyes stayed fixed on her mother's face, the small freckle below her left eye seeming darker in the quiet. She could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the distant lowing of a cow from the barn. Her own pulse throbbed in her temples. This wasn't about permission for a whim. It was about proving soil layers didn't lie, that clay and gravel spoke a language written in resistance and flow. She cleared her throat, the sound loud in the stillness. Multiple auger sizes prevent string binding, Mama. When you hit a tough layer with just one size, the auger binds tight as a drum. You swap out the head, 4-inch for clay, 6-inch for gravel, and it keeps turning. No jamming, no wasted time. Her voice was flat, factual, no pleading. Just the metallurgy of it, the simple physics of torque and soil cohesion. She didn't mention the Acme Hand Auger Series 7 units rusting in her granary, their obsolete couplings making them trash to Briggs Farm Supply but free to her. She didn't need to. The numbers on the page were the evidence. Most people see rusted scrap metal and they see useless junk. Margaret Vance saw potential calibrated against risk. Her gaze lifted from the ledger, meeting Elara S. The small mole above her upper lip seemed to tighten. And Briggs, she asked, her voice low, steady. He agreed to this. The question wasn't about Harlan Briggs's approval. It was about whether Elara had checked the ground before stepping. He laughed, Elara said simply, but he didn't say no when I asked for the augers. She didn't elaborate on the laugh, the way Harlan Briggs's dimple had creased his cheek as he leaned against the counter, brass buttons straining on his navy work shirt. She didn't need to. The ledger held the counter-argument. $435 against a dealer Deepwell rig costing $12,000. The math was the rebuttal. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you stood perfectly still while someone you loved measured your dream against the hard dirt of reality? Not with words, but with the slow, deliberate tap of a finger on paper. When was the last time you felt the seconds stretch like taffy, knowing one wrong breath could shatter the fragile thing you'd built in silence? Answer that. Then come back. Because this is where the world separates the hopeful from the stubborn. The kitchen smelled of dust and old coffee. Elara's scuffed brown work boots were planted firmly on the linoleum, her military straight posture the only thing holding her upright. She saw the flicker in her mother's eyes, the calculation shifting from cost to consequence. Margaret wasn't weighing a machine. She was weighing a daughter's quiet certainty against the memory of lean years, of crops failing under a merciless sun, of neighbors walking away from foreclosed land. Her stocky frame seemed to shrink into the chair, the beige cardigan swallowing her shoulders. The ruler in her apron pocket felt like an anchor. Margaret's finger drifted back to the top line, welding rod $3.40. She read it again. Then coal $14, the vise $8, each repetition a silent question. Elara didn't flinch. She knew the numbers by heart, the way she knew the grain structure of the rusted auger stems, the tensile strength required to bore through 200 feet of earth without snapping. She de-learned it from a discarded vocational school handbook found in a feed store clearance bin, its pages brittle with age but the principles unshakable. Metallurgy didn't care about doubters, physics didn't negotiate. The numbers on that page were the only language her mother spoke fluently when stakes were high. Elara held her breath. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick with everything unsaid, the years of watching her mother mend fences with wire scraps, the way Margaret had taught her to read soil texture by rubbing it between thumb and forefinger, the unspoken lesson that preparation was the only prayer that ever got answered. Margaret finally looked up. Her deep brown eyes held Elara's, searching for the cracks, the hesitation she knew must be there. She saw only resolve, the same set of the jaw Elara had inherited, the defined line of it sharp under the pale morning light. The freckle cluster on her mother's nose seemed to pulse. "You understand," Margaret said, each word deliberate, "if this fails, we lose $435 we cannot replace, and the bean harvest waits for no experiment." It wasn't a refusal, it was a boundary drawn in the dirt, a condition as solid as bedrock. Elara nodded. "I finished the bean harvest first." No argument, no defensiveness. Just the acknowledgement that the farm's immediate needs came before the dream. Her voice didn't waver. She'd already planned the hours, mornings in the fields, afternoons in the granary, nights studying soil charts by kerosene lamp. The notebook with its auger specs and soil layer calculations was already living in her back pocket, its pages soft with handling. She knew the cost of doubt. She felt it herself 3 nights prior, alone in the granary, the wind whistling through the rafters. The auger stem had snapped during a dry run, the fracture clean and mocking under her lantern light. She sat on the cold dirt floor, tracing the break with her thumb, the brass pocket watch ticking against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Quitting had been a real option then, a warm blanket of surrender. But the metallurgy handbook had been clear, brittle fracture meant insufficient tempering. She'd adjusted the forge temperature at dawn, the failure had taught her. It hadn't broken her. Margaret's gaze dropped back to the ledger. Her finger, slow and precise, began tracing the total again. Down the column, past the winch cost, past the hauling fee, past the coal and the vise and the welding rod. It lingered on the final sum, $435. The number wasn't abstract. It was 870 loaves of bread. It was 3 months' worth of seed corn. It was the difference between a lean winter and a hungry one. Her finger stopped. The kitchen clock ticked. A fly buzzed against the window pane. Elara felt the weight of it all pressing down, the rusted augers waiting in the granary, Harlan Briggs's laugh echoing in her memory, the sheer, terrifying audacity of believing cracked metal could become water. She saw the conflict play out in her mother's face, the instinct to protect warring with the deeper instinct to trust the work. Margaret Vance had survived hard years by not gambling, but she'd also survived them by knowing when a gamble wasn't a gamble at all, it was arithmetic dressed in dirt. The finger lifted from the paper. Margaret leaned back in her chair, the wooden legs scraping softly on the floor. She didn't sigh, she didn't frown. She just looked at her daughter, really looked at her, taking in the determined set of her jaw, the dust still clinging to her dark brown hair, the steady calm in her pale blue eyes that said she'd already walked this path 1,000 times in her head. The ruler in Margaret's apron pocket felt suddenly heavy. She opened her mouth, closed it. The words formed slowly, deliberately, like a seed taking root in dry ground. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it landed in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped down a well. "I need to think about it." The words hung there, simple and final. No anger, no dismissal, just the space between risk and reward stretched thin as a wire. Margaret pushed her chair back, the sound sharp in the stillness, and walked to the stove without another glance at the ledger. Elara sat frozen, the brass pocket watch cold against her skin, the echo of those 4 words ringing louder than any promise. The granary waited, the augers waited, the earth itself waited. And in that suspended moment, with the total still glowing under her mother's last touch, Elara understood the true cost of seeing what others threw away. It began with $435, but it was paid for in patience, one silent second at a time. On a Wednesday morning in May of 1985, Elara Vance drove her pickup back toward Briggs Farm Supply, the same gravel road that had carried her home 2 days prior with those rusted Acme hand augers rattling in her truck bed. Her brass pocket watch, warm against her chest, ticked off the minutes. She could feel the small freckle below her left eye tighten as she squinted against the sun glinting off the windshield. The notebook lay open on the passenger seat, its pages filled not with dreams but with soil layer calculations Margaret Vance had taught her to make. Clay required a 4-inch auger, gravel demanded 6. Let me tell you about that notebook, because you need to understand what happens when someone treats dirt like a language before you can understand why Harlan Briggs laughed. Most people see a pile of rusted scrap metal and they see junk fit only for the landfill. Margaret Vance saw potential waiting to be measured, tested, proven. She saw the same thing in her daughter, though she'd never say it out loud. Elara's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she passed the weathered sign for Hardin County. $435 sat in her pocket like a live wire, humming with the weight of her mother's quiet permission. That single sentence, "I need to think about it," had landed days ago, no fanfare, no warning. Just the barest nod over the kitchen ledger, her finger tracing the total. The vise, $8. The fryer tools, $22. Coal for the first winter, $14. Welding rod, $3.40. Total, $84.85. Then the rest pulled from savings, hauling $200, welding $85, winch and tripod $150, $435 total. The number felt solid now, a stone in her boot. She parked beside the red brick building, the scent of motor oil and dust hanging thick in the air. Harlan Briggs stood behind the counter, silver pocket knife glinting in his shirt pocket, hands planted firmly on his hips. His dimple on the left cheek deepened as he spotted her. Elara stepped inside, the bell above the door jingling sharp and clear. She walked straight to the counter, her scuffed brown work boots leaving faint prints on the worn wood floor. No hesitation. She placed the notebook down, open to a page filled with precise sketches of auger couplings and soil strata notes. Her crescent moon birthmark on her right wrist caught the fluorescent light as she pointed. "I need 200 more of those Acme Series 7 augers, Mr. Briggs, same price as last time." Harlan didn't move, he just stared. His hazel eyes narrowed, taking in the notebook, her faded red flannel shirt, the dust still clinging to her jeans from the granary floor. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing, not a cruel laugh, not a sneer. Just the deep, rolling chuckle of a man who'd seen too many things fail. It was the sound of 19 years behind that counter meeting something utterly foreign and mistaking foreign for foolish. His broad shoulders shook, the dimple on his left cheek flashing like a beacon. "Girl, you'll snap that winch at 50 feet, he boomed, slapping the counter hard enough to make the pens jump. "That old rig of yours. It ain't built for deep water. You'll be hauling scrap out of a hole, not hauling water up." Elara didn't flinch, she didn't raise her voice. She just tapped the notebook with her index finger, right where the soil layers were mapped out in her mother's careful script. "The gravel layer requires narrow augers. I'll change sizes every 20 feet. The clay holds the bore open long enough to swap." Harlan stopped laughing, just like that. The dimple vanished. He leaned forward, elbows on the counter, his face suddenly serious. He smelled of pipe tobacco and machine grease. "You think I don't know dirt?" he said, his voice low now, edged with something sharper than mockery. "I've sold pumps to this county since Eisenhower was in office. You'll hit the shale at 120 feet, that's where the real work starts. And you'll be down there alone, elbow deep in mud, trying to muscle that twisted iron. Girl, you'll break your back before you hit water. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time someone told you your idea was impossible, not out of malice, but because they genuinely couldn't see past their own experience? Answer it, then remember this." Elara Vance didn't argue. She didn't explain her cleverness. She just stood there, pale blue eyes steady, the small freckle below her left eye almost pulsing in the harsh light. She saw what Harlan couldn't, the metallurgy of those couplings, the tensile strength still humming beneath the rust. She knew the Acme Series 7 could handle 300 feet if guided right through the layers. She'd calculated it line by line in the notebook Margaret had given her after high school graduation, the one with the water-stained cover and the frayed binding. Most people see failure written all over a rusted auger pile. Margaret Vance saw the margin for error in every curve of forged steel. "You're right about the shale," Elara said, her voice calm, flat. "It'll be tough, but the auger stem won't twist if I keep the rotation slow and steady through the transition. I've got the specs right here." She turned the page. "See? The torque tolerance drops at 120 feet, but the gravel layer above gives me room to adjust." Harlan straightened up, his tall frame blocking the light from the front window. He ran a calloused hand over his receding hairline, the freckle cluster on his right temple standing out against his warm tan skin. "Specs don't pay the bills, girl. Sweat does. And you're fixing to sweat yourself into a hole you can't climb out of." Elara closed the notebook. The leather cover felt familiar, worn smooth by years of use. She looked him right in the eye. "I'm not asking for your opinion, Mr. Briggs. I'm asking for the augers, at the price we agreed." Harlan Briggs let out a short, sharp breath, not a laugh this time, something closer to resignation. He shook his head slowly, the dimple gone, the square jaw set hard. "You're damn stubborn, you know that? Like your mother." He sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of years spent watching good people make bad bets. "Fine, 200 more. But when you're digging that auger out of the mud tomorrow, don't come crying to me." Elara didn't smile. Didn't thank him. She just slid the exact cash across the counter, $200 counted out in worn bills. Harlan took it, his fingers brushing the coins in his pocket. He handed her the receipt without looking at it. "You'll be back," he muttered, already turning to the next customer. "Everyone comes back." Elara Vance turned and walked out of Briggs' Farm Supply. The bell jingled again behind her, a bright sound against the low murmur of the store. She didn't look back. She crossed the parking lot, her boots crunching on the gravel, the sun hot on the back of her neck. She could feel Harlan's eyes on her, could almost hear the unspoken "I told you so" forming in his head. But she kept walking, toward her truck, toward the granary, toward the augers waiting in the dust. Her brass pocket watch ticked against her chest, steady as a heartbeat. The notebook sat heavy in her hand, full of numbers and layers and the quiet certainty that dirt could be read like a book. She opened the truck door, the metal hot under her palm. She climbed in, the engine coughing to life on the first try. As she pulled away, she saw Harlan Briggs in the rearview mirror, still standing in the doorway, shaking his head. His laughter faded into the Iowa wind, lost beneath the rumble of the engine and the steady, defiant beat of her own pulse. "You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It buried them. Whole families walked away from land their grandfathers broke. But Elara Vance wasn't borrowing. She wasn't gambling. She was working with what the world had already paid to get rid of: rusted iron, time, patience. $435, not a loan, not a dream, a fact written in dust and steel. And facts once set down couldn't be laughed away. The augers waited, the earth waited, and Elara Vance drove on, the small freckle below her left eye catching the sun as she turned onto the county road, her destination clear. Not back to the farm, not yet. Straight to the granary where the real work began. Where the doubters' words dissolved into the hum of the engine and the promise of clean water 300 feet down. Where defiance wasn't shouted, it was welded, measured, proven, one precise turn of the auger at a time. The real question isn't whether the earth holds water, it's whether you're willing to dig deep enough to find it. On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Emmett Vandermeer stood in the gravel lot behind his machine shop in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched a 17-year-old boy drag a cracked engine block out of his scrap pile without asking permission. But this story doesn't start with defiance. It starts with vinegar. The sharp tang of it biting the air inside Elara Vance's granary as she hauled the last of the Acme hand augers off her truck bed. 1,500 rusted units, their couplings obsolete, deemed worthless by the county road crew. They clattered like broken bones against the wooden floorboards, each one a promise nobody else could see. Her pale blue eyes narrowed against the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of light from the high window. The crescent moon birthmark on her right wrist caught the glow as she knelt, brass pocket watch ticking steady against her ribs beneath the faded red flannel shirt. "Let me tell you about vinegar, because you need to understand rust before you can understand why Harlan Briggs was wrong. Most people see rust and they see decay. Elara Vance saw a surface waiting for chemistry. She poured white vinegar into a galvanized tub, the liquid pale and clear as creek water, then dumped in handfuls of coarse salt. The reaction hissed, a slow dance of acetic acid meeting iron oxide, peeling back years of neglect. She worked methodically, steel wool scraping in tight circles over each auger's coupling. Her knuckles whitened with the effort, the vinegar stinging tiny cuts on her fingers. This wasn't cleaning, it was revelation. Every stroke exposed the underlying steel, smooth and unbroken beneath the corrosion. She de-learned it from a dog-eared copy of Practical Metal Restoration, a book she'd bought for 30 cents at the Grinnell auction, its pages brittle with age but its truths unshaken. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at rust and saw possibility? She didn't wait for an answer. Her hands kept moving, dipping each auger back into the bath, watching the bubbles rise like tiny prayers. The vinegar smell clung to her clothes, sharp and alive, as the first hour bled into the second. By midday, the tub's liquid had turned the color of weak tea, and the augers gleamed dully in the tub's bottom. She hauled them out one by one, laying them on burlap sacks to dry. Her shoulders ached from the repetition, but her focus never wavered. This was the work nobody saw, the hours of preparation that made madness look like sense. She checked her notebook, its pages filled with soil layer calculations and auger specs, the ink smudged from her grip. One entry read, "Clay layer requires 4-inch auger, gravel needs 6-inch." She traced the line with her thumb, the paper rough against her calloused skin. Then she walked to the far corner of the granary, where the borrowed Lincoln electric welding rig hummed softly under a tarp. Mr. Henderson from the high school shop class had lent it to her with a shrug and a warning, "Don't burn the place down, Elara." She nodded, her reply short and plain, "I won't." The rig was older than she was, its dials yellowed with age, but it worked. She strapped on the welding mask, the glass darkening her vision to a cool blue. The first match of the torch flared, a bright, hungry star in the dim space. She adjusted the oxygen and acetylene valves, her hands steady despite the heat. This was where the couplings would live again. She spent 2 nights studying a discarded vocational handbook, its spine cracked, its diagrams precise. Matching stems required a 60-degree bevel, a filler rod of 70,000 psi tensile strength. One wrong angle and the weld would fail under pressure. She laid the first auger stem against its mate, clamping them tight in a borrowed vise. The vise, $8, the welding rod, $3.40, vinegar and salt for the bath, $1.20. Total for the first adapter, $12.60. She lit the torch again. The flame hissed, blue at its heart, white at the edges. She guided it along the seam, the molten metal flowing like liquid silver. Sparks flew, stinging her neck, but she didn't flinch. The weld built slowly, layer upon layer, each pass stronger than the last. When she lifted the mask, the seam was smooth and unbroken, a silver scar across the steel. She ran her finger over it, feeling the heat, the promise. The tripod came next. She defound the railroad ties behind the county maintenance yard, stacked like forgotten bones in a gravel lot. 6 of them, their wood blackened by creosote but solid at the core. She hauled them home at dawn, the truck groaning under their weight. Now she measured each one with a carpenter's square, her pencil marking clean lines against the rough grain. The ties were heavy, each one weighing nearly 200 pounds, but she lifted them with a grunt, muscles straining in her back and arms. She'd read about load paths in a civil engineering text from the library, its pages stamped Hardin County Public Library, "Do not remove." The tripod needed 3 legs, set at 120 degrees, braced against lateral force. She drilled pilot holes, the bit biting deep into the wood, then drove in galvanized spikes, each 1/8 inches long. Her hands moved with a rhythm born of years watching her mother build shelves and repair fences. Margaret Vance had taught her that way of seeing, not how to swing a hammer but how to read the grain, to feel the tension in a joint. Most people see wood and they see a thing that holds still. Margaret Vance saw a thing that breathes. Elara repeated the phrase silently as she worked, the words a steady drumbeat in her mind. She bolted the legs to a central hub, a steel plate she'd cut from an old plowshare. The bolts were tight, the angles true. When she stood back, the tripod rose like a rough-hewn cathedral, its legs splayed wide and sure. She tested it with her weight, leaning hard against one leg. It didn't budge. The wood creaked but held. She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of creosote on her skin. The winch was the final piece. She bought it for $150 from a farmer clearing out his barn, a geared monster with a steel cable as thick as her thumb. She mounted it to the tripod's apex, the bolts sinking deep into the wood. Then came the test. She filled 5 sandbags with river sand, each one weighing 50 pounds. The total load, 250 pounds, more than the auger would face drilling through clay. She tied the cable to the sandbags, the knots tight and square. Her heart pounded, but her hands were calm. She cranked the winch handle, the gears grinding in protest at first, then smoothing into a steady rhythm. The sandbags rose slowly, the cable glinting in the dust-filled light. She watched the tripod's legs, searching for any give, any sign of weakness. There was none. The wood held, the bolts held. The welds on the auger stems, still cooling in the corner, would hold too. She lowered the sandbags, the cable paying out smoothly, then cranked them up again. And again. 10 times she tested it, each lift a silent argument against Harlan Briggs' laughter. The memory of it still hung in the air, the silence lasting about 2 seconds, then his deep chuckle rolling across the parts counter at Briggs' Farm Supply. "Girl, you're trying to drill water with a potato peeler." She hadn't argued. She just turned and walked out, her reply short and plain, "I'll need a receipt." Now the winch proved her right, one crank at a time. The gears turned without strain, the cable unwinding clean and true. She stopped at the 10th lift, her arms trembling but her focus unbroken. She checked the auger stems again, their welds cool to the touch. Perfect. No porosity, no cracks, she'd done it. The system was complete. She stood in the center of the granary, the tripod rising before her like a sentinel. The winch cable gleamed in the dust, catching the late afternoon sun. Every piece had cost pennies, salvaged, borrowed, rebuilt. The whole operation had cost $435, a number she'd written in her notebook a dozen times. $435 against a dealer's deep-well rig costing $12,000. $435 against Harlan Briggs' certainty that she'd fail. She ran her hand along the tripod's leg, feeling the rough grain of the railroad ties, the cold steel of the winch. This wasn't scrap. It was material waiting for someone to see it. The vinegar smell still clung to her clothes, sharp and clean. The brass pocket watch ticked against her ribs, steady as a heartbeat. She thought of Margaret's quiet voice the night she'd laid the ledger on the kitchen table, "I need to think about it." And then 2 days later, the single sentence that changed everything, "You have my permission." No ceremony, no fanfare, just proof. She de-earned it, one precise turn of the auger at a time. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date, June 10, 1985. Below it, she sketched the tripod's dimensions, the angles exact. Tomorrow, she'd drill the first hole. Tomorrow, the earth would answer. But for now, the granary held its breath. The augers stood ready in their rows, their couplings gleaming. The winch cable hung taut and true. The tripod stood complete, a silent testament to what could be built from what the world had thrown away. The real question isn't whether the earth holds water. It's whether you're willing to dig deep enough to find it. On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Elara Vance stood in the gravel lot behind her machine shop in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched a 17-year-old boy drag a cracked engine block out of her scrap pile. Without asking permission, wait no, that was Emmett Vandermeer back in '87. This story starts later June 12, 1985, under a sky bleached white by a relentless Iowa sun. Elara lowered the first Acme Hand Auger Series 7 unit into the test hole she had dug behind her granary. The tripod stood complete, a silent testament to what could be built from what the world had thrown away. The real question isn't whether the earth holds water, whether you're willing to dig deep enough to find it. Elara fed the auger stem section by section into the hole, her brass pocket watch ticking against her ribs. As she worked, each lift brought up damp soil the color of burnt coffee. She lowered casing behind the bore exactly as her notebook dictated. Clay requires 4-inch auger, gravel needs 6-inch. Her pale blue eyes tracked the depth gauge, her crescent moon birthmark stark against sun-flushed skin at 30 feet. The soil turned from loose topsoil to packed silt. She adjusted her grip on the winch handle, her scuffed brown boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. Short lifts. Only, she reminded herself, short lifts. And steady pressure, the auger bit clean earth like a promise. But this story doesn't start with the auger turning, it starts with the silence of a collapsed hole. The auger worked until it didn't, until the earth decided otherwise at 50 feet. The stem hit compacted clay, the kind that squeezes like wet cement under pressure. Elara felt it first through her palms, a sudden vibration traveling up the winch cable. Then a groan from the metal as the auger bound tight. She eased the pressure, her jaw tightening. She tried reversing the rotation, the winch straining against the unseen grip of the earth. Sweat stung her eyes. She wiped it with the back. Her wrist, her thin eyebrows drawn together in concentration. The auger wouldn't budge. Let me tell you about lateral pressure. Because you need to understand why clay matters before you can understand why her hands were shaking. Margaret Vance saw lateral pressure. Margaret saw the way packed earth squeezes inward from all sides, not just down like a falling roof. Most people see dirt. And they see dirt. Margaret saw forces. Most people see a stuck tool. And they see a broken tool. Margaret saw physics waiting to be outsmarted. Elara had read her mother's notes on soil mechanics, the ones tucked inside the worn vocational school handbook bought for $25 at the Beeman auction. She knew the theory, but theory doesn't stop a stem from snapping when the earth says no. Elara climbed the tripod ladder, her muscles burning. She peered down the hole. The auger was frozen solid at 50 feet. Her notebook lay open on the granary floor beside the ledger, showing $435 spent so far hauling $200 welding, 85 winch, tripod 150. She ran her fingers over the broken stem still attached to the rig. The metal was thinner than her calculations. Suggested a hairline crack, ran along the coupling, where the factory had stamped Acme Series 7 obsolete. The earth had found the weakness the world had written off. As scrap, she felt the familiar sting behind her eyes, not tears, frustration pure and sharp. She had measured the stem thickness twice. She had accounted for clay density. Her numbers were right, the material was wrong. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then she started laughing, a short bitter sound that echoed off the granary walls. She climbed down, her military straight posture rigid against the weight of the mistake. She knelt in the mud beside the hole, her faded red flannel shirt darkening at the knees. She pulled the crescent moon birthmark into her mind, a cool anchor against the heat rising in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The auger was supposed prove Harlan Briggs wrong, the doubter, the man who laughed when she asked about deep well drilling rigs at Briggs Farm Supply. Just 3 weeks ago, Harlan Briggs saw rusted hand augers. And he saw junk. Elara saw potential. Harlan saw tools designed for shallow post holes. Elara saw a system that could reach water if the couplings held. Most people see scrap metal, and they see scrap metal. Harlan saw worthless iron. Elara saw engineered steel waiting for a second purpose. She had laid her notebook on the counter at Briggs Farm Supply, her finger tracing the soil layer calculations for the Vance farm. Harlan had leaned back in his creaking chair, his hazel eyes crinkling at the corners, not with warmth but disbelief. He said, deep well drilling rigs cost $12,000. Girl, you think that rust pile can do what a cat rig can? The silence lasted about 2 seconds, then he started laughing. It was the sound of 19 years behind the parts counter, meeting something unfamiliar and mistaking unfamiliar for impossible. His laugh wasn't cruel, it was the sound of certainty. It was the sound of someone who knew the rules of the game. He patted her shoulder, his dimple flashing. You keep dreaming, sweetheart. But this ain't a hobby farm. Elara had walked away, her scuffed boots crunching on the gravel lot behind Briggs Farm Supply. She didn't argue, she didn't explain. Her jaw stayed set, her pale blue eyes fixed on the horizon. She knew arguing with certainty was like shouting into a windstorm. It just made you hoarse. Now kneeling in her own mud, she felt the echo of that laugh, the quiet insult of his words. Hobby farm. She dug her fingers into the damp earth, feeling the coolness beneath the surface heat. She had spent years preparing, since childhood, really, since Margaret first showed her how to read the soil like a book. She had studied metallurgy from library books on interlibrary loan. She had practiced welds on scrap iron, until her hands knew the heat. She had calculated every variable except this one, the hidden weakness in the cast iron stem, where the factory had cut corners to save pennies. The earth didn't care about her preparation, the earth only cared about pressure. She stood, her legs stiff from kneeling. She walked to the granary workbench, her boots leaving deep prints in the soft earth. She picked up the calipers, her hands steady. Now the broken stem section lay on the bench beside her notebook. She measured the thickness at the coupling point, 3/16 of an inch. Thinner than the 4-inch specification in the Acme catalog she found in the Hardin County Library archives. She measured it again, 3/16. The lateral pressure in compacted clay required at least a 1/4 inch to resist buckling. The math was brutal simple. The earth applied force, the stem bent. It snapped. It was that easy, it was that stupid. The frustration hit like a physical blow. She kicked the workbench leg, her boot connecting with a dull thud. The pain shot up her shin, sharp and grounding. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She just stood there breathing hard, the smell of hot metal and damp earth thick in her throat. She looked at the tripod silhouetted against the white sky. The rig stood complete, useless. She thought about Margaret's quiet warning the night she laid the ledger on the kitchen table, her mother's finger tracing the $435 total. Margaret had said, I need to think about it. She granted permission 2 days later with one short sentence, you break it, you buy it. No ceremony, no fanfare, just the weight of responsibility, handed over like a tool. She thought about Harlan Briggs' laugh hobby farm. She thought about the $11.40 she'd spent on welding rod for this rig. The mud would swallow that too if she quit now. She walked to the scrap pile behind the granary. Rusted iron glinted in the sun. She found a section of 1/4 inch steel pipe, longer than her arm. She dragged it to the workbench, her muscles screaming. She measured a sleeve long enough to reinforce the coupling point. She marked it with chalk. Her hands moved with the rhythm of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Welding wasn't magic. It was heat and patience, and knowing when to pull back. She fired up the torch, the blue flame hissing to life. She cut the sleeve, her eyes narrowed against the glare. The metal glowed cherry red, then cooled to dull black. She sanded the edges smooth, her fingers tracing the roughness, until it felt right. The sleeve fit over the coupling like a bandage over a wound. It wasn't elegant, it was necessary. She carried the reinforced stem back to the hole, her arms ached from the weight of the steel. She reassembled the auger section by section, the new sleeve sliding over the coupling with a satisfying click. She secured it with a single tack, while the metal spitting sparks in the afternoon light. She climbed the tripod ladder again, her breath coming fast. She lowered the auger into the hole, the reinforced stem disappearing into the darkness. She fed it down past 40 feet, 45, 50. The winch handle turned smoothly, no vibration, no groan. She felt the auger bite the clay layer at 50 feet. She applied steady pressure, short lifts. Only she pulled up the first load of packed clay, her heart hammering against her ribs. It worked, the sleeve held. She pulled up another load, the clay came up clean, no mud, no sludge. She felt the tension in her shoulders ease just a fraction. She fed the auger down deeper, 55 feet 60. She was winning then. It happened again. The winch handle locked solid in her hands. The vibration shot up her arms sharper this time, a metallic shriek from below. She reversed the rotation. The auger wouldn't budge. She strained against the handle, her knuckles white, her muscles burned. She climbed down, her legs trembling. She peered into the hole. The reinforced stem was frozen again, deeper this time at 60 feet. She grabbed the winch cable with both hands and pulled with everything she had. The cable cut into her palms. She pulled until her vision blurred. The auger didn't move. She let go, the cable snapping back against the tripod with a hollow clang. She stood there, swaying her chest. Heaving, she looked at her hands, raw and bleeding. She looked at the hole, swallowing her work, her money, her hope. She knelt in the mud again, this time not to measure, but to surrender. She dug her fingers into the earth, feeling the coolness beneath the heat. She felt the familiar sting behind her eyes this time. It didn't stop. She let the tears come silent and hot. Tracking through the dirt on her cheeks, she thought about driving to the bank in Beeman, signing the papers for the loan Margaret had warned her about. She thought about selling the farm cheap to Harlan, Briggs' cousin, who'd been sniffing around since the price collapse began. She thought about quitting. She stayed there for a long time, the sun sinking toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. Finally, she wiped her face with her sleeve. Her pale blue eyes were red-rimmed, but clear. She stood up, her scuffed boots heavy with mud. She walked back to the workbench. She picked up the calipers again. She measured the reinforced sleeve. It was 1/4-inch steel it should have held. She measured the broken stem section, still attached to the rig, 3/16 of an inch. The sleeve covered the coupling, but the stem itself was still too thin. Where it met the next section, the lateral pressure had found the weak spot just below the sleeve. She had fixed the wrong part. She walked back to the hole. She didn't look at the tripod. She knelt at the edge. She reached down and pulled the auger stem free. It came up with a sickening slurp of mud. The coupling held, the sleeve held but 6 inches below it. The stem had snapped clean through like a dry twig. The broken end gleamed dully in the fading light. She held it in her hands, the metal cold and heavy, the weight of $435, the weight of Harlan Briggs' laugh, the weight of her own certainty. She dropped the broken stem into the hole. It fell silently into the darkness, mud oozing. Collapsed whole as the snapped stem lies in the muck. Elara hammering rubber gaskets onto casing joints. Her brass pocket watch swung against her hip as she worked, the chain catching the granary light. She pulled a strip of black rubber from the tire inner tube she'd scavenged at Briggs' farm supply last Tuesday, ignoring the way Harlan had shaken his head when she asked for the discards. He'd called them worthless twice before sliding the bundle across the counter for free. Worthless. She folded the rubber into a thick washer, pressing it hard against the threaded joint where the casing pipes met. The first hole had collapsed because mud seeped through those seams at 80 feet, swallowing the auger stem hole. This time the rubber would seal it. She hammered the gasket into place with short, precise blows of her ball peen. Each tap echoed the rhythm Margaret used when driving nails into fence posts, steady, no wasted motion. Her mother's wooden ruler, worn smooth from decades in her apron pocket, lay beside the tool chest. Elara had measured the inner tube strips against it, 3/8 of an inch thick. Exactly what the casing threads needed to bite into without tearing. Let me tell you about tire inner tubes, because you need to understand mud before you can understand why this mattered. Most people see mud and they see failure. Margaret saw mud as information. She'd say it while checking the rain gauge on their porch. Mud tells you what the earth is holding onto and what it's letting go. Elara remembered her mother's voice as she tightened the next casing joint. The rubber compressed under the pipe's weight, forming a seal the mud couldn't breach. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smudge of grease below her left eye. The granary smelled of damp earth and machine oil. Outside, Hardin County baked under a late May sun. Corn shoots were just breaking soil in the fields, but Elara's focus was underground. Where the first attempt had failed at 80 feet, she'd marked her notebook. Clay layer ends. Gravel begins. Water should flow here, but the casing joints had leaked, the whole walls giving way like wet sandcastles. Now she'd fix the weak point. She checked the ledger one last time, hauling $200, welding $85. Winch and tripod $150, total $435, every cent accounted for, no room for another collapse. She signaled Margaret with a wave. Her mother stood at the granary door, arms crossed, the beige cardigan pulled tight against the morning chill despite the heat building outside. Margaret didn't speak. She just nodded, the dimple on her left cheek deepening as she watched Elara lower the auger stem into the test hole. The tripod winch groaned as the cable paid out. Elara fed the stem sections one by one, each connection clicking home with the new rubber gaskets sandwiched between. At 50 feet, the auger bit into the clay layer smoothly. The handle turned with familiar resistance, the spiral flighting carrying up dark, slick soil. Elara's shoulders loosened. This felt right. The muscles in her arms remembered the motion from childhood, helping Margaret dig post holes, turning garden soil with hand tools when the tractor broke. She'd learned torque before algebra, pressure before poetry. At 70 feet the clay thinned, the soil coming up grew grainier. Elara slowed her cranking, watching the casing follow the auger stem downward. The rubber gaskets held. No mud seeped through the joints. Hope flickered, warm and fragile as a candle flame. Then at 80 feet, exactly where the first hole had collapsed, the auger handle jerked in her hands. A dull thud echoed from below. Elara froze. She leaned closer to the hole, listening. Silence. Then a slow, sucking sound as mud oozed into the casing. Not through the joints this time, through the bore itself. The gravel layer was shifting, collapsing around the auger stem. She yanked the handle back. Too late. The stem jammed solid. She pulled harder, her boots sliding in the loose dirt at the hole's edge. The winch cable went slack. She de-snapped the stem again, not at the coupling, not at the sleeve. At the point where the auger met the unstable gravel, Elara dropped to her knees, peering into the darkness. The casing stood straight, the rubber gasket still sealed tight, but the hole around it was caving in. Mud slithered down the sides, swallowing the auger stem whole. She felt the familiar weight in her chest, the $435 sinking into the earth. Harlan's laugh echoed in her skull. She spat dust from her mouth and stood. Margaret appeared beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Her mother's fingers were calloused from decades of farm work, but the touch was light. "You narrowed the bore too fast," Margaret said. Her voice was low, matter-of-fact, like stating the due point. Elara nodded. In her notebook she'd written, "Clay layer requires 4-inch auger. Gravel needs 6-inch." But she tried to stretch the smaller auger deeper to save time. The gravel couldn't support the narrower hole. It was collapsing under its own weight. Margaret squeezed her shoulder once and walked back to the house without another word. Elara sat on the granary steps, the ledger open on her lap. She traced the itemized costs with her finger. The vise, $8. The fryer tools, $22. Coal for the first winter, $14. Welding rod, $3.40. Total, $84.85. Then the big numbers: hauling, welding, winch, tripod, $435 total. She'd been so sure the rubber gaskets would fix everything. They had, but the earth itself was the real problem. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you trusted your numbers but forgot the ground beneath them? Elara closed the ledger. She walked to the truck and pulled the last Acme hand auger from the bed. Its rusted blades caught the sun. 1,500 units Briggs had paid to get rid of. Obsolete couplings, he'd said. Worthless. But Elara saw what they were: precision-engineered steel flighting, hardened teeth, a proven design for moving soil. She carried the auger back to the hole. Margaret's words echoed, "You narrowed the bore too fast." Elara knelt at the edge. She measured the auger's diameter against the casing pipe. 4 inches, too narrow for gravel. She needed 6. But she had no 6-inch auger, only these. She ran her fingers along the rusted blades, then she saw it. The answer wasn't in the auger, it was in the casing. Let me tell you about casing pipes because you need to understand pressure before you can understand the fix. Most people see pipe and they see a tube. Margaret saw pipe as a wall against the world. She'd say it while mending fences: a pipe holds what the earth tries to take back. Elara grabbed her notebook, flipped to the soil layer diagram. Clay, gravel, bedrock. At 80 feet the gravel layer needed wider support, but the casing was already set at 4 inches. She couldn't widen it now. Unless she sketched fast. 2 casing pipes nested together, the outer pipe 4 inches, the inner pipe 3 inches. The gap between them filled with gravel she'd pump down later, like a filter. It would stabilize the bore without needing a wider auger. She'd drill the initial hole with the 4-inch auger, then insert the narrower inner pipe. The gravel layer would pack into the space between pipes, locking everything in place. She checked the math. The inner pipe would leave enough room for the auger stem to turn. Barely, but it would work. She found Margaret in the kitchen, rolling pie crust dough. Elara slid the notebook across the table. Her mother read the sketch without comment. Traced the nested pipes with her finger, looked up. "You'll need gravel fines," Margaret said, from the creek bed. Elara nodded. She'd haul it herself. Margaret's eyes flicked to the itemized costs on the next page. The gravel would cost $20. She didn't ask where Elara would get the inner pipe. She knew. The old irrigation lines in the South 40, rusted but sound. Margaret pushed the notebook back. "Go," she said. 2 days later, Elara stood at the hole again. The inner pipe was in place, salvaged from the irrigation lines and cut to length. She demixed the creek gravel with water into a slurry and pumped it down the casing. It settled around the inner pipe like concrete. Now she lowered the auger stem through the inner pipe. The 4-inch blades turned freely in the 3-inch space. At 80 feet, the auger hit the gravel layer. Elara held her breath. She cranked slowly. The handle resisted, then gave. Soil rose through the inner pipe center. No mud seeped in. No sucking sounds. The bore held. She cranked deeper. 85 feet. 90, 95. The gravel layer deepened. The auger turned smoother now, the flighting carrying up clean, coarse grains. Elara's arms burned, but she didn't stop. 100 feet. 105, 110. Then at 120 feet, the auger turning smoothly through the gravel layer at 120 feet. Elara cranking the winch past 250 feet, her pale blue eyes locked on the depth gauge, the brass pocket watch on her chain swinging like a pendulum against her faded red flannel shirt. The rope groaned through the pulley, a steady rhythm that had carried her through 2 collapsed holes and now promised redemption. Behind her, the Iowa sun bled orange across the Hardin County fields, casting long shadows that made the tripod stand like a skeleton against the dust. She felt the ache in her forearms, the grit under her fingernails, the small freckle below her left eye stinging with sweat. But this time, the casing held. No mud oozing in, no sudden collapse swallowing her work, just the clean, gritty turn of the auger biting deeper. Let me tell you about those rubber gaskets, because you need to understand how they seal the casing joints before you can understand why this hole didn't collapse like the first 2. She had hammered them on yesterday, thick strips of recycled rubber from old conveyor belts, salvaged from the tannery offcuts they were landfilling in Marshalltown. Most people see rusted augers and they see scrap metal. Margaret Vance saw potential. Her mother had said it years ago, standing in their Beeman kitchen with her wooden ruler tucked in her apron pocket, tracing the grain of the workbench. Material doesn't lie. It tells you what it can do if you listen. Elara had listened. She had pored over soil layer calculations in her notebook until the ink blurred, the clay requiring a 4-inch auger, the gravel needing 6. Now, at 250 feet, the gaskets were doing their job, pressing tight against the casing threads as the auger descended, keeping the walls stable where loose earth had betrayed her twice before. She paused at 260 feet. The winch handle stuck for a heartbeat, then gave way with a shudder she felt in her teeth. Gravel layer. She knew that vibration, the loose, shifting material that had choked the 4-inch auger on the second attempt, filling the hole like wet sand until the stem snapped and sank into the muck. Time to switch. She lowered the tripod arm, unhooked the 4-inch stem, and reached for the 6-inch auger head she had modified from the Acme units. The coupling was her own design, welded from scrap steel plates she'd cut with the oxyacetylene torch in the granary, but it held solid. She lifted the heavier head into place, felt the weight settle onto the casing with a metallic clunk. Most people see a cracked coupling and they see a reason to give up. Elara Vance saw a puzzle to solve. She cranked again, slower this time, letting the wider blades cut through the gravel without jamming. The rope tightened, the winch turned, and the auger bit deep, each rotation clearing the loose material with a steady scrape. No clogging, no hesitation, just progress. You know what most drillers would have done at 260 feet? They would have called it a day, said the gravel was too much, charged extra for the headache. But Elara knew the soil layers like the lines on her hands. She had studied the county extension maps Margaret kept folded in her apron pocket, the ones Harlan Briggs had laughed at when she showed them. Now, the 6-inch auger was proof that gravel wasn't a stop sign, it was just another layer to conquer. 270, 280, 290. Her breath came short, not from the work but from the waiting. She had drilled this deep before, only to find dry sand or clay that wouldn't yield. But today the auger turned with a different feel, a looser resistance, a whisper of give. She hit 300 feet on the dot, and then it happened. A hiss, a gurgle, and the rope went slack. She froze, heart hammering against her ribs. Water, real water surging up the casing. She dropped to her knees, peering into the hole, the brass pocket watch cold against her chest. Clear water gushing into the casing as she checked her depth gauge. She scrambled for the bucket and stopwatch, hands trembling not from fatigue but from the weight of this moment. 10 gallons per minute, exactly what her notebook had predicted for this aquifer. She filled the bucket 3 times, timing each pour, the numbers holding steady. 60 seconds, 10 gallons. 60 seconds, 10 gallons. Enough for a household, for crops, for life. Now let me tell you about the cost, because you need to understand what this meant before you can understand why Harlan Briggs' laugh still echoed in her ears. This well cost her $350. Let me break it down for you line by line the way Margaret taught her to balance the farm books, the adapter she welded $15, the casing pipe $200, the labor of her own hands $135, total $350, against a dealer's price of $5,000, $5,000. For something she built for $350. She sat back on her heels, the Iowa dust coating her worn blue jeans, and let the arithmetic sink in. $350, 10 gallons a minute, 300 feet deep, and the water kept flowing, cold and clear, a promise rising from the earth. The sun dipped lower, painting the field in gold. She thought of Harlan Briggs standing behind his counter at Briggs Farm Supply, arms crossed, that dimple on his left cheek deepening as he laughed. The silence had lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing. Not cruel, no, just the sound of 19 years behind the parts counter meeting something unfamiliar and mistaking unfamiliar for impossible. Hand augers for deep wells. Girl, you're out of your damn mind, he'd said, shaking his head. You'll drown yourself in that hole. She hadn't argued. She had just turned and walked out, her notebook tucked under her arm, the brass key on her steel ring jingling with each step. Now the water proved him wrong, but it wasn't about him. It was about the material. The rusted Acme hand auger series 7 units nobody wanted, the scrap metal they were paying to get rid of. She had seen what it could become, and here it was. She dipped her hand into the water, felt the cool rush against her skin, the crescent moon birthmark on her wrist glistening. A smile spread across her face, small but unshakable, reaching her pale blue eyes. This was it, the proof. Not some abstract victory, but hard numbers in the dirt, 10 gallons per minute at $350. Up to this point, Elara had been fighting doubt, the kind that whispers in the dark when your hands are raw and your back is broken. That was about to flip. She stood, wiping her hands on her jeans, and walked to the truck bed where the rusted augers lay like discarded bones. She ran her fingers over the pitted metal, feeling the history in the rust. Most people see this and they see junk. Margaret Vance saw potential. Her mother's voice came back, quiet but certain. Material doesn't lie. It tells you what it can do if you listen. Elara had listened. She had spent nights in the granary with a quarter-bought vocational handbook, learning metallurgy from the margins, how steel moves under stress, how couplings fail, and how to fix them. She had studied the grain structure of the auger blades, the tensile strength of the stems, until it lived in her bones. And now, here it was, water where there had been only dry earth and laughter. She thought of the ledger Margaret kept on the kitchen table, the one where she traced the $435 total with her finger and said, I need to think about it. Then, days later, the quiet yes. No ceremony, just permission. Now that $435 had birthed something real. Something that could outlast droughts and price collapses. Something that cost $350 where others charged $5,000. She knelt again, scooping water into the bucket, watching it swirl. The flow never faltered, 10 gallons, steady. She thought of the neighbors, how they'd shake their heads when she hauled those augers home, how they'd call it a hobby while their own wells ran dry. But hobbies don't feed families. Hobbies don't survive 18% interest or foreclosure waves. This was survival. This was seeing what others wrote off and building a future from it. Let me tell you about the gravel layer, because you need to understand why the 6-inch auger mattered before you can understand why this well won't fail when the drought hits. Gravel shifts. It collapses. But the wider blades cleared it without jamming, and the gaskets sealed the casing like a vault. That's engineering. That's not luck, that's knowing your material. She stood, bucket in hand, and walked to the edge of the field. The water gushed behind her, a steady heartbeat in the quiet Iowa evening. This was the moment. Not the grand reveal, not the applause, but the quiet certainty of numbers adding up where they shouldn't. $350. 10 gallons per minute, 300 feet deep, and the water kept flowing, clear and constant, as she checked her depth gauge one last time. A neighbor's pickup kicked up dust on Elara's lane just 3 days after that June 12th test. It was a 1978 Ford F-150, paint bleached pale by Hardin County sun, kicking rooster tails of gravel as it slowed. Elara stood by the granary door, wiping grease from her hands onto her worn blue jeans, the brass pocket watch cold against her wrist bone where she'd pushed up her flannel sleeve. Her pale blue eyes tracked the truck as it stopped, driver's door swinging open to reveal Hank Johnson, boots already dusted from his own fields. That birthmark on her right wrist, a crescent moon against fair pink skin, twitched as she braced herself. Hank didn't waste words. He just stood there, hands on hips, sweat darkening the collar of his work shirt. "My irrigation pump failed at 200 feet, he said, voice rough as corn husks. "County Extension Office says I need a new deep well rig. Briggs quoted me $5,000. He spat into the dust. "Hell of a thing when your water dries up before your corn does. Let me tell you about irrigation pumps because you need to understand what $5,000 meant on a drought-stricken farm in 1985. Most people saw rusted augers and they saw scrap metal. Elara saw engineered steel that had already bored through bedrock, paid for by farmers who junked them for newer models. Hank saw only the number Briggs had thrown at him, a number that could choke a man's future. Elara nodded toward the granary, where the tripod stood silhouetted against the light. "Come see what I've got." She led him past the welder's cart, past the coffee can holding rusted horseshoes she'd salvaged from a farm sale last spring. There it stood, the Acme Hand Auger Series 7, its couplings welded smooth, winch cable gleaming in the dust motes. Hank ran a calloused hand over the casing joints she'd hammered rubber gaskets onto just yesterday. "You got water at 300 feet with this?" he asked. Elara didn't boast. She just opened her ledger to the page dated June 12, 10 gallons per minute, 300 feet deep, clear water flowing. Hank whistled low. Briggs said it was impossible. Most people see rusted augers and they see junk. Margaret Vance saw practical geometry, the angles where steel met soil, the physics of leverage in a farmer's hands. That was her philosophy, written in the margins of library books on metallurgy. Elara had lived it since she was 17, studying soil layer calculations while others chased softball games. Now Hank Johnson stood in her granary, the scent of coal dust and hot metal in the air, and the math didn't lie. "Dealer rig costs $12,000 new," Elara said, tapping the ledger. "My rig cost $435 to build. Cost to drill your well, $350. Hank's eyes widened. 5,000 minus 350 equaled $4,650 saved. $4,650 that wouldn't vanish into Briggs' cash register. He didn't laugh. He didn't need to. The numbers sat there in black ink, undeniable as a thunderstorm. Hank signed the contract that afternoon for $200 down. Elara's pen scratched across the page as she noted it in the ledger, her cheap notebook with the cracked leather cover, the one Margaret had given her after high school graduation. She felt the familiar weight of the brass pocket watch against her wrist as she wrote, the freckle below her left eye crinkling with concentration. That night, she sat at the kitchen table under the single bare bulb, adding up the columns. $4,650 saved for the Johnson farm. $4,650 that stayed in Hank's pocket instead of vanishing into some wholesaler's ledger. Margaret slid a cup of coffee toward her, the wooden ruler in her apron pocket clicking softly against the table. "You were right," she said, the words plain and final, just like the permission she'd granted weeks earlier when Elara laid the $435 total on that same table. No fanfare, just the quiet acknowledgement of proof. Elara nodded, tracing the coffee cup's ring on the wood. Relief wasn't a shout. It was the way her shoulders finally dropped after months of carrying doubt like a sack of grain. Word traveled the way water travels on flat ground. By Monday morning, 2 more pickups idled by the granary. First came Marge Peterson, whose well had silted up during last year's dry spell. Then Frank Riley, limping from a tractor accident that had left him with a cane but not a pension. They didn't ask about Briggs' price. They'd already heard Hank Johnson's story at the Beeman feed store over coffee and pie. Frank leaned on his cane, squinting at the Acme auger. "My granddaddy used these things back in the 1930s, he said, voice raspy, through the hole set in the burn pile when electric pumps came in. He shook his head, the dimple on his left cheek deepening. "Damn shame." Marge just nodded toward her truck bed. There, half covered by a tarp, lay 3 rusted auger stems. "Found 'em in my barn last night," she said. "Figured you might use 'em. Let me tell you about rusted augers because you need to understand what happens when people stop seeing material as scrap. Those stems from Marge's truck bed weren't junk. They were precision-cast steel with hardened flighting, paid for decades ago by farmers who discarded them for newer models." Elara ran her fingers over the couplings, feeling the grain of the metal beneath the rust. Each stem could be refurbished for welding rod and elbow grease, costing pennies against the dealer price for new casing. Frank Riley tapped his cane against the granary floor. "There's more where that came from," he said. "Old man Henderson's place down county line got a whole shed full of 'em." Elara's ledger suddenly felt heavier in her hands. This wasn't just Hank Johnson's well anymore. This was something growing, root by root, in the cracked earth of Hardin County. The next week, 3 more neighbors arrived with spare augers lashed to their trailers, a coffee can of rusted couplings from the Miller farm sale, 2 warped but serviceable tripods hauled from a barn in Marshall County. Even Harlan Briggs' nephew showed up, unloading a set from his uncle's own scrap pile behind the farm supply store. "Uncle Harlan said to tell you he was wrong," the boy mumbled, avoiding Elara's eyes. He left the augers by the granary door and drove off without waiting for thanks. Elara didn't chase him. She just added the new inventory to her ledger: 7 additional stems, 3 tripods, 1 winch in working order. Cost, $0. Value, thousands saved for farmers who thought they were out of options. That night she sat in the granary alone, the scent of coal dust thick in the air. She traced the crescent moon birthmark on her wrist with her thumb. For the first time since that June 12th test, she let herself breathe deep. The work wasn't done, but the proof was in the ground and in the ledger and in the rusted steel piling up by her granary door. Let me tell you about ledgers, because you need to understand how relief feels when it arrives after years of silence. Most people see numbers and they see dry accounting. Elara saw lifelines: $4,650 saved for Hank Johnson, $350 earned per well, the slow accumulation of trust measured in gallons per minute and dollars kept in farmers' pockets. She ran her finger down the page as she tallied the contracts. Hank Johnson, $200 down, Marge Peterson, $150, Frank Riley, $200, and 7 more names after that. 10 contracts total, 10 wells drilled or promised. The brass pocket watch ticked softly against her wrist as she added the columns. $2,950 in deposits. Enough to buy new welding rod, enough to patch the granary roof before winter, enough to prove this wasn't a fluke. She closed the ledger, the cracked leather cover warm under her palm. Outside, the Iowa wind whispered through the cornfields, carrying the scent of damp earth and possibility. Relief wasn't a fanfare. It was the quiet click of the ledger snapping shut. It was the weight lifting from her shoulders as she walked back toward the house, the freckle below her left eye catching the last of the sunset. It was knowing the next pickup kicking up dust on her lane wouldn't be the last. Elara signed the 10th well contract in her ledger. Cracked earth under a blistering July sun, fissures spiderwebbing across fields where corn should have stood shoulder high. The air shimmered above Hardin County, Iowa, thick with the smell of baked soil and desperation. Corn prices had collapsed 40% since spring, the county extension office reported, and every farmer within 20 miles felt the knife twist. Elara Vance stood at the edge of her own 80 acres, the crescent moon birthmark on her right wrist catching the glare as she watched a neighbor's irrigation pump sputter and die. No debt. No power bill. That was the difference between her and them. Let me tell you about 18% interest, because you need to understand why a hand-cranked rig made from rusted scrap outlasted million-dollar pivots when the drought hit. Most people see a deep-well rig, and they see a machine needing diesel and credit lines. Margaret Vance saw a thing that must stand on its own feet. She taught Elara that years ago, stirring oatmeal in their Beeman kitchen, her wooden ruler always tucked in her apron pocket. Now, in 1988, that lesson was the only thing keeping water flowing. The drought didn't just dry the soil, it dried up credit. Banks called in loans, co-ops tightened supply lines, and electric pumps choked on the 18% interest farmers had borrowed against at the peak. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It turned profitable spreads into foreclosure notices. One farmer in Hardin County lost 300 acres because his pivot system cost $12,000 upfront and needed $800 a month in electricity just to run. Elara's rig cost $435 total to build, every penny itemized in her notebook. The vise, $8. The welding rod, $3.40. The winch and tripod, $150. She dehauled the rusted Acme hand auger series 7 units herself for $200, their obsolete couplings making them trash to the machine shop. But to Elara, those couplings were just a metallurgy problem, a mismatch in thread pitch she'd solved with a tapered adapter forged from scrap steel. Cast iron could handle the torque if you respected its grain structure, she'd written in her ledger after the first collapse. No magic, just physics the doubters had forgotten. Her neighbor's electric pumps stood silent now, expensive monuments to a gamble that backfired. The power lines hummed with current, but nobody could afford the bill. 1 mile east, Harlan Briggs's pivot system sat idle, its sprinklers like skeletal arms raised in surrender. He'd laughed at Elara 2 years prior when she'd walked into Briggs' farm supply with her notebook open to soil layer calculations. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then he started laughing, a deep, rumbling sound that shook his broad shoulders, his dimple flashing on the left cheek, freckles clustered like spilled pepper on his right temple. "Hand augers for deep wells," he'd said, leaning against the counter, silver pocket knife glinting in his shirt pocket. "Girl, you'll be digging till Christmas for one well. Dealer rigs do it in a day for $5,000. Elara hadn't argued. She just tapped the notebook where she'd written $11.40 in materials against a $390 dealer part. Then she walked out, the screen door slapping shut behind her. Now, under this same sun, his laughter felt like dust in his throat. Elara's rig didn't need electricity. It needed muscle. Her hands, calloused from welding, gripped the winch handle as she cranked the tripod into position over a new hole. The rusted auger bit into the earth, turning smoothly through the gravel layer at 120 feet, exactly where her notebook predicted. She de-learned from the first failure. When mud oozed into the collapsed hole, snapping the stem, she diagnosed weak casing joints. Now rubber gaskets hammered tight between the pipes held firm. Water seeped into the casing, clear and cold. 10 gallons per minute at 300 feet. That was the proof from June 12, 1985, and it hadn't lied. While others watched their corn wither, Elara's clients, smallholders who'd bet on her, were pulling water. 120 wells by 1995, she'd project in her ledger, revenue $15,000. But 1988 wasn't about growth. It was about survival. Her system survived because it was never exposed to the risk that broke everyone else. No debt. No external power, just elbow grease and a brass pocket watch ticking against her wrist as she worked. Up to this point, the drought had been winning. That was about to flip. Elara wiped sweat from her brow, the small freckle below her left eye dark with grime. She didn't look triumphant. She looked tired, resilient. The kind that comes from nights alone in the granary, staring at her notebook, wondering if quitting would be smarter. But she kept going because Margaret's voice was in her head. "You were right to wait for proof. Not praise, just acknowledgement." Now, proof was everywhere, in the water bucket beside her rig, in the contracts piling up in her ledger, in the way neighbors nodded when they saw her truck. Resilience wasn't a shout. It was showing up when the earth cracked and your back ached and the doubters had all the reasons why you should stop. A pickup kicked up dust on the lane leading to her farm. Not a neighbor this time. Harlan Briggs himself, stepping out of his truck, hands on his hips, the stance rigid. He didn't approach the rig. Just stood at the gate squinting against the sun. Elara kept cranking, the winch cable gleaming in the dust. She didn't hurry. When the auger cleared the surface, mud dripping from its blades, she set the brake and walked over. No smile, no "I told you so," just waiting. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of 2 years of drought and one man's pride. Then Harlan cleared his throat. His dimple didn't flash this time. "I was wrong." 3 words, no decoration. You could see the cost in the way his shoulders slumped, the freckle cluster on his temple standing out like a bruise. He didn't offer an excuse. Didn't mention the drought or the interest rates, just stood there, defeated by facts. Then he did something practical. "Got a dry well on the North 40, he said, voice rough. "Can you fix it?" Elara nodded once. "Bring your truck at dawn." No gloating, no lesson, just work. Harlan tipped his hat, the gesture stiff, and walked back to his pickup. As he drove off, Elara turned to her rig. The water bucket was half full, cool and clear. She knelt beside it, dipping her hands in. The drought hadn't spared her, corn margins were gone, the farm's income slashed, but her well business thrived. While others sold equipment to pay bills, she was adding clients. The ledger would show it later, revenue up 30% that year, all from emergency repairs and new installations. But right then, it was just water in her palms, the smell of wet earth, and the knowledge that free material, rusted iron, discarded couplings, could outlast gold-plated machinery when you knew how to see it. Let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at something the world called trash and saw what it could become? Not for glory, not for quick cash, but because you knew the physics, the chemistry, the quiet truth in the grain of it. Answer it, then get back to work. Elara did. She hauled the auger back into position, the brass pocket watch swinging against her flannel shirt. The sun beat down, relentless. The earth cracked, but here, at her rig, water flowed. Her notebook lay open in the grass, pages fluttering. Soil density calculations, auger specs, cost breakdowns, all in her precise hand. No jargon, no fluff, just numbers that added up. $435 to build what others paid $12,000 for. $11.40 in materials for a part dealers charged $390. Every figure reconciled because she'd checked them twice. That arithmetic was her armor against the drought. While banks seized land, her clients paid cash, $350 per well, cash she could hold in her hands. No waiting for checks to clear, no interest to pay, just water and work and the slow accumulation of proof. Let me tell you about risk because you need to understand why free material is the only thing that cannot be taken away. Most people see debt and they see opportunity. Margaret Vance saw debt and she saw a noose. She deset it over coffee, finger tracing the $435 total on the kitchen table. I need to think about it. Days later, the permission came in one short sentence. You were right. No ceremony, just trust earned by numbers. Elara cranked the winch again, muscles burning. The auger sank deeper past the gravel into the sandstone layer. She adjusted the torque, remembering the first collapse, the stem snapping because she'd pushed too hard. Failure taught. Now she felt the resistance through the handle, knew when to ease off. This was the pleasure of the video, the audience here to learn how something actually works. Not theory, not hope. The real mechanism, how cast iron flexes under load, how soil compaction affects drilling speed, why rubber gaskets beat welded joints for temporary casing. Elara's hands knew it now. Her notebook held it, the ledger counted it, and the drought, it couldn't touch any of that. Let me tell you about 1888 because you need to understand why resilience isn't born in good times. It's forged when everything else burns. Most people see a drought and they see an end. Elara Vance saw a test, and she passed. The pickup lane was empty now, Harlan gone, but his words hung in the air. I was wrong. 3 words that meant everything. He'd come alone, no audience, no save face. Just a man admitting he'd mistaken unfamiliar for impossible. It cost him his reputation as the county's irrigation authority, but he'd paid it. And in paying it, he'd given her something, credibility. If Harlan Briggs admitted she was right, others would listen. The drought would break eventually, corn prices would recover, but the lesson was set. Her rig pulled water while electric pumps sat silent, a testament to what free material could do when you saw it right. Elara dipped her hands in the bucket again, the water cool against her skin, the earth cracked all around her. But here at her rig, water flowed. Elara's rig pulling water while a neighbor's electric pump sits silent. The earth cracked all around her, but here at her rig, water flowed. Elara's rig pulling water while a neighbor's electric pump sits silent. Her thumb traced the inked line in the ledger. 120 wells, $15,000 revenue, 1995. The brass pocket watch in her apron pocket grew warm against her thigh, same one her mother Margaret had worn when she finally nodded yes to that first $435 gamble back in 1985. Let me tell you about ledgers, because you need to understand how a number becomes a promise before you can understand how that promise holds water through drought and debt. Most people see a ledger and they see dry numbers. Margaret saw the pulse of the land. She saw the way ink bled into paper like rain into thirsty soil, and she taught Elara to read it that way too. The next entry waited, clean and unbroken, 300 wells, $75,000 revenue 2005. Then the final line, written in a different ink, sharper pen, 850 wells, $200,000 revenue 2026. The arithmetic held. Year after year, the cost per well never budged from $350. Not in 1990, not in 2000, not in 2020. The dealer rig still cost $5,000, always would, because the dealer rigs ran on new steel and borrowed money and 18% interest rates. Elara's rig ran on rusted augers and patience. Let me tell you about rust, because you need to understand how oxidation becomes opportunity before you can understand why nobody else saw what she did. Those Acme Hand Auger Series 7 units weren't junk. They were engineered steel with a tensile strength of 65,000 pounds per square inch, discarded because the couplings were obsolete. But the shafts, perfect. The helical flights, untouched. All it took was welding new adapters, $85 worth of rod and gas, and a winch tripod for $150. The hauling cost $200, total $435. Every well drilled since 1985 proved that math. Every cracked field during the 1988 drought proved it louder. Corn prices collapsed 40% that year, farms folded. but Elara's rig kept turning. Water doesn't care about commodity markets. Water only cares about finding its level, and her rig found it 10 gallons per minute, 300 feet down for $350, while the bank repossessed neighbors' center pivots. Now let me pause here and ask you something. When was the last time you held something that outlived your first car payment? Not a phone, not a laptop, something real that kept working while everything else rusted or broke or got called in. Elara could hold her rig's main shaft. She could hold the brass pocket watch. She could hold the notebook where she'd first sketched the adapter design, its pages brittle at the edges but the math still sharp. Clara Vance learned this during summer breaks from college. She'd arrive in June, 22 years old, boots scuffed from walking fields, notebook already open in her lap. Elara never handed her a manual. She handed her a caliper and a rusted auger stem. "Tell me about this steel," Elara would say, her pale blue eyes steady behind strands of dark brown hair escaping her side part. Clara would measure, calculate, frown. "It's cracked here," she'd say, pointing to a hairline fracture near the coupling. "But the grain structure's still tight underneath." Elara would nod, the crescent moon birthmark on her wrist catching the granary light. Most people see a crack and they see failure. Margaret saw a lesson in metallurgy. Clara learned to read soil layers like her aunt read weather signs. She learned to adjust the auger speed for clay versus gravel, to spot the subtle shift in resistance that meant bedrock was near. She learned the rhythm of the winch, how to feel the cable bite without snapping it. She learned the smell of hot welding rod and the sound of clean water hitting casing, all while the ledger grew thicker. Let me tell you about apprenticeship because you need to understand how knowledge transfers without speeches before you can understand why Clara never asked for permission. She just showed up, summer after summer. Measuring, calculating, hauling. She kept her own notebook now, filled with soil density tables and cost projections. She'd sit at the kitchen table where Margaret once traced that $435 total, her finger moving down columns of figures. The numbers never lied. $350 per well, always, even when steel prices jumped, even when gas doubled. Elara found ways, used salvaged casing pipe from a decommissioned dairy. Swapped welding rods for labor with the machine shop in Harlan. Kept the model lean because lean was the only way it survived. While others expanded with loans and shiny new rigs, Elara stayed small. Her rig fit in a trailer. Her crew was one person, sometimes two when Clara came home. No payroll taxes, no insurance premiums. Just elbow grease and ingenuity. The hard year taught her that. The 1988 drought didn't break her because she'd never taken the risk that broke everyone else. She didn't need 18% interest to drill a well. She needed rusted steel and know-how, and that never got called in. You know what 18% interest did to operations that borrowed to expand in the late 70s? It ate them whole. One missed payment and the bank owned your land, your equipment, your future. But Elara's rig cost $435 up front. No payments, no interest, just sweat equity. So when the drought cracked the earth like old pottery, her rig kept turning. Water flowed. Checks arrived, slowly at first, then steadily. $15,000 by 1995, $75,000 by 2005, $200,000 by 2026, all from a model that never changed, $350. Every time. Let me tell you about consistency, because you need to understand how stubbornness becomes strategy before you can understand why the doubters finally shut up. Harlan Briggs stopped laughing after the third well he commissioned. He'd stood there in his navy blue work shirt, hands on hips, dimples showing as he shook his head. "You're wasting your time, girl," he'd said back in 1985, the freckle cluster on his temple catching the sun. "That rust pile won't drill past 50 feet, but it drilled 300, and when the water gushed, Harlan just stared. Then he walked over, boots crunching on gravel, and said 3 words, 'I was wrong.' No decoration. No excuses, just the truth, costing him something. He'd come back alone the next week with a list of neighbors who needed wells. He became her first steady client. Now he sent Clara summer work. "She's got your eyes," he'd tell Elara, nodding at the girl bent over the auger stem. "And your mother's hands." Clara graduated with an engineering degree but came home anyway. Not because she had to, because she saw what others missed. She saw the material in the scrap. She saw the future in the rust. Last summer, she'd sketched a new adapter design in her notebook, lighter, faster, using salvaged aircraft aluminum. Elara didn't flinch, didn't question. Just handed her the calipers and said, "Show me." Clara had measured, calculated, adjusted. The prototype worked, cost $78 to build, saved 20 minutes per well. Small gain, but over 850 wells, that was real money, real time, real legacy. Elara watched her niece move through the granary with the same quiet focus she'd once had. The same way Margaret moved through the kitchen, apron pocket holding that wooden ruler like a talisman. Clara didn't need permission. She had proof. She had numbers. She had the brass pocket watch now too, tucked in her own apron, ticking steady as a heartbeat. Elara felt the weight of it all as she closed the ledger. 31 years of wells, 850 holes in the earth where water now flowed, $200,000 earned by seeing what others threw away. The granary smelled of oil and dust and old paper. Sunlight slanted through the high windows, catching motes in the air like glittering promise. No fanfare, no ribbon cutting, just work done well year after year. The kind of satisfaction that settles in your bones, not your bank account. The kind that makes you look at a rusted auger and see a future. Clara's car kicked up dust on the lane, same blue pickup she'd driven since college. Elara didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood on the porch, hands in her faded red flannel pockets, watching the dust cloud rise. The brass pocket watch warmed against her leg. The ledger sat open on the table behind her, the final line clear. 850 wells, $200,000 revenue, 2026. Clara Vance's car pulling into the yard in 2026. Clara Vance stepped out of her car into the hard Iowa sun, the heat rising off the gravel in visible waves. She carried a rolled sketch in one hand, her knuckles tight against the paper. The brass pocket watch warmed against her leg. The ledger sat open on the table behind her, the final line clear. 850 wells, $200,000 revenue, 2026. Clara Vance's car pulling into the yard in 2026. Elara Vance stood by the porch railing, her pale blue eyes fixed on her niece.